Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as...
Yeah, so it's kind of embarrassing when I'm walking down the street and I just start kissing at people, but it's just also really hilarious.
This is Tourette's podcast, part of the Geeks Rising Network. I'm your host, Ben Brown. Good Lord, there's been such a nice bump in activity in the past week or so. Lots of new listeners, lots of feedback. We've got some questions to answer in a minute. First off, in case you missed the announcement, Tourette's podcast has joined a podcast network, the Geeks Rising Network, which I think is the perfect home for this show, as it comes with tons of support and a reach into a much broader audience. And with the network's emphasis on well-being and awareness, that's everything we want. And it comes during Tourette Awareness Month, May 15th through June 15th. This is the first full episode under the distribution of Geeks Rising. Big thanks to Bandrew Scott, who owns the network and sent in a really good question, actually, with a diversity of answers that we'll get to here shortly. This is going to be a stellar episode with a major credit to our guest this week. Many of you know her from a television show on the A&E network. She's right ahead. But since we have a lot of new listeners this week, many of whom come to the podcast with curiosity about what it's really like to have Tourette syndrome, and I've been hearing from more non-TS listeners, which is perfect. Lots of people with TS listening, lots of people without TS listening. So just a tiny bit of catch up on what this is all about. You can rewind to Season 1, Episode 0, and that's the in-depth look at my backstory and how Tourette syndrome has always been kind of a governing feature in my life. Nothing I can do about it. So yeah, I have Tourette syndrome. My name is Ben. I've been doing this podcast since the beginning of 2018 after living my adult life in the closet, really, about having TS. Because, if you're like me and you grew up with Tourette syndrome and the jokes and the parodies and the social pressures to be as normal as you can be, you're not really incentivized to be open about it. So I wasn't. I masked my tics. I found ways to disguise them the best I could. For example, I would pair my vocal tics with coughs and throat clearings and things like that sounded somewhat normal, more normal than just the bare tic. I did that so people wouldn't look at me twice and call me a weirdo or something. I didn't want to be misunderstood or judged in a way where society and employers and girls and so on wouldn't take me seriously, or would just get the complete wrong idea about me based on a popular misconception of what TS is. And so 2017 rolls around and I'm still ticking constantly and I'm still living with the various other conditions that also come along with Tourette syndrome. And I just asked myself the question, what if you start being yourself? Like really, what if you stopped worrying about what people thought about your tics? And take all that energy and effort that you've put into hiding, take all of that and put that into openly talking about it, to where ideally people will see the real you and understand you better and in turn reserve judgment or just have a better diagram of what Tourette syndrome is for the people who live this currently incurable neurological disorder. What if? I could be open about it with a good result, like Michael J. Fox in Teen Wolf, if you'll pardon a ridiculous simile. He can't hide that he's really a werewolf on the inside, and so he comes out to his entire high school as this fur-covered monster who everyone ends up loving because when he's loud and proud about being a werewolf, he's good at basketball. So that's maybe a weak analogy. I'm not comparing Tourette syndrome to being a werewolf. But you know what I mean, being open about something that you were worried about and getting a good result. But podcasting, that's part of what I do for a living anyway at my day job, and I adopted podcasting as my outlet and a way of connecting with other people who have TS. Because that's something I had never done. I had never talked with other people who live with this, to see where they're at and how they've managed it and what we can learn from one another. And I learned very quickly, and this persists to this day, that a huge number of people with TS have lived the same way. Isolation, all too aware of the stigma, taking measures to hide their tics for fear of ridicule. Now, I don't want this all to sound like a huge bummer because, you may know the television version of TS, the Deuce Bigalow version, the comedic portrayals that in the pop culture sense have defined for so many people what TS is. And of course, it's a misrepresentation, but the real TS is just so much more interesting and mysterious and fascinating and loaded with unanswered questions that I think it's something that anybody can find an interest in and appreciate is something that's really actually kind of cool and comes with advantages in the brain, something extra that we can apply to our lives. The Tourette Association of America just recently published an article going into the formation of this podcast and my backstory, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes at tourettespodcast.libsyn.com. Libsyn is spelled Libsyn. And I'll have it on the social media channels too. Welcome if you're brand new to the show. Tons of past episodes waiting on you. All of them are still relevant. Each episode, I talk to somebody else out there in the world who has Tourette syndrome, and in totally unscripted fashion, we dig down and find all kinds of funny commonalities and things that I think anybody can relate to. But it's also a solid way to learn what it's really like and possess a bit of knowledge that hasn't caught up to greater society yet. Despite all the efforts, if this is your first time really exploring what Tourette syndrome is, you'll be ahead of the curve. That said, I want you to send in any questions you have about TS and what it's like to live with it and what you'd like to understand better. Here's a question that I got from Bandrew Scott. He's the owner of Geeks Rising. That's the network that this podcast is now a part of. And he's a celebrated YouTuber in his own right on the Podcastage channel. But here's his question.
Hey Ben, how you doing? This is Bandrew. Hope you're doing well. I got a really quick question for you, although it may be somewhat of a difficult question. The question that I have is, what can someone without TS do to help the TS community? Or rather, what can a person without TS do to help someone with TS? Should we be asking questions when we find out somebody has it? Should we be ignoring tics? Or I guess what I'm asking is, what is the proper etiquette, and is there anything that somebody without TS can do to help the community? Thanks so much for answering my question, Ben, and keep up the great work. Talk to you later.
Okay, so that sounds like an elementary question. What can people do to help? But it's really not. I mean, the answers are pretty diverse to this. I think it's a great question. I don't necessarily think it's too obvious either. I put this question to the Tourette's podcast discussion group on Facebook. And the community there had answers, and they varied a bit. As far as non-Touretters helping the community, a listener named Adam said this, and I really think this covers it nicely. He says, as a parent of a TS child, the only thing I can do better is be accepting. Some actions or noises can be considered annoying. Sometimes his comorbid conditions can be frustrating and often a bit out of control. I know that he doesn't want to have TS in his life. I know he doesn't mean to annoy or cause frustration. I also know that without TS, he wouldn't be who he is. The person he is, I wouldn't change for the world. In my eyes, he is exceptional. He is gifted, and he is my son. So, I only wish that as non-TS people, you will accept those that are different than you. I hope you don't judge people on noises or involuntary actions. I hope you judge those on their ability, intelligence, creativity, and how additive they are to the narrative of your life. I know my son has made a welcomed and permanent mark in my life, one I wouldn't change. I am sure that those who are accepting and able to dispel the stigmas associated with TS can also share in this positive and indelible mark on their life. End quote. Adam, that's a perfect answer to how people can help, in a really easy way when you look at it. Other listeners said varying but similar things. For me, I would just ask that we retire the Tourette's jokes. I mean, even from a critical standpoint, very generally, it's a bit worn out and kind of lacking on originality at this point. We can all agree about that, right? All of us. We've heard the joke, it's been done. Time to get a little bit more high-minded. I mean, groaning jokes work too, but let's also remember that when we make TS jokes, kids hear them, including kids with TS. Just think about that. But there's another piece to Bandrew's question about etiquette. Do you ask someone with TS about it? Do you turn your head and pretend not to notice when someone's having a tic episode? That's a really great question. Akiva, who's been a really great Touretter to connect with, said this. I think it would depend on the situation. If there is a person with noticeable tics, and they're in an uncomfortable public environment, it might be very reassuring for someone to come over to them and put them at ease by saying they understand what's going on. But if it's solely to satisfy the asker's curiosity, I think it borders on insensitive. Basically, ask yourself why you are commenting or asking questions. For the other person's sake, or your own. If you have a close friend, then I think it would be appropriate to ask in the right environment. Great answer, Akiva. I think those two answers from Adam and Akiva really just nicely set a tone for things here. And the rest is filled by intrigue and mystery and nuance and laughter and on and on. And what I hope the ultimate takeaway here is for everybody, no matter who you are or what you got, is self-acceptance. That's the biggest thing of all, I think. And it took me forever to get there. And it's still challenging at times, I guess, but things are good. except that I'm already going long with this intro, and we have a really great conversation to get to. But I think this was a great way to start, just kind of initiate new listeners and, even within the Tourette community. I don't consider myself an insider. I'm not a Tourette expert. I have Tourette syndrome and I've lived it. So I'm an expert on myself. And the people I interview are experts on themselves. And that's what we do. We just kind of put it together to find these odd surprises and weird commonalities and just things we can all relate to and learn from and, even laugh at. So stick around. I hope you enjoy. 2 more quick things here. Big shout out to Dr. Kristin Morehead. You've heard her name many times in this podcast before, along with Jaleesa Jenkins and Laura Belliers. Together, we have a writing credit on an editorial about the future of tic disorder diagnosis. I definitely want more time to talk about this, and I don't want to give it short attention here, but I will have a link to it, to this editorial, in the show notes. And if you visit Dr. Morehead on Twitter, she's an amazing scientist, by the way. She's at CCONELEA, at CConelea, and pinned to her timeline currently is a link to that editorial, which was written in response to a recent report and recommendation on how to consider TS in the future. We had some issues with it. I'm going to go more into this soon, but I'll say it's such a cool thing for the science community and for the Tourette community to get together and talk about the best application of science when it comes to TS. Lastly, in the most recent full episode, we talked about a new guideline from the American Academy of Neurology, a new guideline for doctors that had some great stuff in it, but some of you took issue. Hat tip to Michael Dye in Scotland, among others, who reached out, took issue with a portion of the guideline that encourages doctors to inform newly diagnosed kids and parents that TS may just go away at some point, as that can happen when you go from childhood to adulthood. Sometimes tics just kind of go away for people, but the problem some of you raised with that is we all know TS can totally persist into adulthood, and so, isn't a better approach to just kind of keep beating the drum of acceptance and awareness, so TS isn't something we feel like we need to avoid in our lives. Why not just go ahead and accept it for what it is and treat it in the best way necessary at the times you feel like you need to treat it? And in the event that you become an adult and you still have TS symptoms, then, maybe you've got a better handle on it by then. I don't know. I do agree with it that I think it may be comforting for a newly diagnosed Touretter to hear that it might just go away, because that's definitely a possibility, but it might be worth looking into what that means for people whose TS persists throughout their lives. And it also maybe furthers the narrative that it's just a childhood disorder. And if you listen to this podcast, adults all over the world live with it. So that's what some of you had to say, and I really appreciate you weighing in. Okay, let's get to it. Kristin Morehead is a name you might already know. She's a college student. She's a great ally to the LGBTQ plus community, and we know her from the A&E television series Raising Tourette's, which a lot of people connected with as a better portrayal of TS, something more honest. And we do get to hear what she thought of it personally. I was so stoked to talk with her and hear about her advocacy and just her life in general, with all kinds of things to relate to. Here it is, my talk with Kristin Morehead.
My name is Kristin Morehead. I live in Florida, and I'm a college student who has Tourette syndrome. And basically, I would introduce myself as someone who kind of advocates for Tourette awareness, and I've pretty much done that all my life.
So I might be blanking on it, but I don't think we've had many talks on this podcast in a contemporary sense about transitioning from high school to college and bringing with you a tic disorder, which ideally should be no big deal, but there's anxiety anyway with going to college, potentially in a place far from home. And then you add in the social fears that we all kind of have, when it's time to make your mark. And what do you think, Kristin? Did you have anything like that? I mean, any transitional stuff? I'm asking this because I'm sure people have turned to you for advice on this kind of thing.
Yeah. So I guess in order to understand my transition into college, it kind of helps to understand my transition from middle school to high school. So my tics used to be in around like the end of middle school, beginning of high school, were very severe. I would have like full body shaking tics. They looked like, seizures, and I would have paralysis tics. I would have very loud vocalizations and coprolalia. And it was just like a really difficult time. But anyway, so going from middle school to high school, like my first couple weeks of ninth grade were especially bad with my tics. And so I was like getting pulled out of class like every day for having these like big tic attacks. And just like, it was an awful time. So as I got older through high school and my tics started decreasing, I, felt better about, going to school and like being in band and everything.
Yeah.
So when it came time to go from high school to college, I was really nervous because I didn't want that big of a transition like what had happened in middle school to high school to happen again in college, especially because I was going to be, 2.5 hours away from home.
Yeah.
And like normally the person I turn to when I'm having these like big tic attacks or like even just in general with my tics is my mom. She helped me so much through high school, and like she would have to leave work every day to come pick me up, and it was just a whole big thing. But basically, like being away from home for the first time was, really scary, and I didn't know how the transition was going to affect me. I go to the University of Florida, and so I'm really lucky that my university has a very prominent, well-established disability resource center. They're amazing to work with. I called their office before I even left my home to set up accommodations for myself with like testing and things like that, because that's been one of the things that has helped me so much is, having a separate testing environment. And so I set myself up with the DRC and made sure that like I had all my accommodations. And then I just like started reaching out to like people who were going to be like, once I got there, I established my support network very, very quickly. I made sure I had people who knew me, who knew about my Tourette's, who could help me if anything was going to go wrong.
It's cool.
So I think like the biggest thing about transitions, no matter what transition it is to have a support system and a plan for if things were to go bad, or even if things are going well, like just having people who you can rely on, no matter where you are, to be able to support you through, bad tics and stuff.
Wow. So, I mean, this was all self-initiated, kind of building that community around you and seeking what was there and really kind of taking advantage of these resources that were around you. I mean, did you have much access to the Tourette community before that, or the broader disability community, or?
Yeah. So when I turned 13, I became a youth ambassador for the Tourette Association of America. And basically what I did was I don't know if you've talked to any other youth ambassadors.
Not to my knowledge, actually. I don't think I have.
Interesting. Okay.
Definitely want to change that.
Yeah, so the Youth Ambassador Program is funded by the Tourette Association, which I know your mom was very involved with. But basically it's this program that takes like teenagers, 13 to 17, and trains them to present about Tourette syndrome, like give presentations to local schools and basically, teaches them how to be ambassadors, like peer-aged ambassadors. So basically, like, it's one thing to have, an adult, like, come in and talk to the class about Tourette's, but it's another thing to have a peer who has Tourette's, who is around the same age as the students, because a lot of these presentations go to, like, different schools. And so it's another thing to have a peer who is your same age come talk to you about not just the Tourette's, but also the anti-bullying aspect of it was a big deal in the program.
Yeah.
So like what would happen is once I got trained, anytime there was a local school around my area who would contact Tourette Florida and ask for a youth ambassador or like a presentation, I would go to that school and give like an hour, 45-minute presentation about Tourette. And if there was like a newly diagnosed child who wanted, a presentation, I would like talk to them beforehand and just like kind of be a mentor and, just give presentations about Tourette.
Wow. So when you were presenting, this was just a general student audience. What were there any sort of catchy kind of, I guess, quickly relatable ways to describe your experience, in a way where the general public can kind of grasp onto it?
Yeah. So, I mean, when they taught us the presentation, it was like the same presentation that every youth ambassador would learn. And there were ways to kind of personalize it, but basically I would like give a little introduction. I would ask them if they noticed anything about me. And then I would because I got so used to asking that question and my mind would now switch to say, oh, you have to tick now. And so I would actually tick more after I asked, do you notice anything? Which was not intentional, but like it just so happened that I wanted them to notice my ticks.
Right. Yeah, not like you're putting on a show or anything.
Exactly. And then I would explain that I have Tourette's and I would give them my diagnosis story. And then I would kind of launch into some of the facts. I would like call them fun facts, Tourette's neurodevelopmental and it's hereditary and there's no cure and things like that. And all the while, like trying to not necessarily be funny, but like be relatable, like talk to them as equals and as peers rather than as like an adult coming in to give a presentation. I really wanted it to be about a fellow student talking to other students about Tourette.
Yeah, and absolutely.
So in that way, it was just kind of it was just a really, really great experience for me.
Well, I mean, that had to be such a great social experience anyway, just meeting so many people, traveling from place to place.
Oh, yeah. And they actually, the Florida chapter of the Tourette Association, when I was chosen to be a youth ambassador, there were 2 other people who went with me, and they basically like flew us out to Washington, D.C., where we were being trained and like paid for our hotel and everything. And it just so happened that the national conference, the biennial national conference was also that year. And so me and my mom stayed for the conference and we went to all these workshops and it was really cool. But part of, actually, I forgot one of the biggest parts of the Youth Ambassador program training was that we actually, at the end of the 2 or 3 days that we were there, we went to, because it was in Washington, D.C., we went to Capitol Hill to basically advocate for like CDC research funding for Tourette and like to advocate for like more research and more money for Tourette, medications and stuff.
Right.
And so that was a really cool thing. I basically got to meet like every Florida congressman and senator, or at least one of their staffers, and tell my personal story and advocate for people with Tourette, which I thought was really cool.
So is that the direction you see yourself going kind of on a permanent basis, is just being, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty drilled into advocacy as just a practice in life.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And, I've been diagnosed with Tourette's since I was 9, and obviously I've had Tourette's my whole life. So it's really, I've just accepted it as something to make use of, like if I have this thing that I can't control and it's a part of me, why not turn it into a good thing?
Yeah.
And so I'm a naturally very extroverted person. But I think that has kind of steered me towards not just advocating for myself, but advocating for others. And I think that the more that I can do to raise awareness and stop the harmful stereotypes about Tourette, the better off the community will be.
Well, I mean, you're already off to a pretty amazing start with that, especially with with A&E and raising Tourette's. Did you want to talk about that for a minute and the experience you had with the show?
Yeah, sure. So basically, I went to a summer camp for kids with Tourette's called Twitch and Shout.
Yeah.
It was based just outside of Atlanta. Mm-hmm. I'm sure you've heard of it. But
yeah, talked to some counselors there. Yeah.
Yeah, it's honestly the best place on earth. Like, I don't care what Disneyland has to say. Like, Camp Twitch and Shout is the happiest place on earth because I went there for like 8 years in a row. It was crazy.
That's awesome.
But basically, while I was at camp, some of the producers of the show contacted the director of the camp and were like, "We want students with Tourette to do this thing." And so the director of the camp contacted my mom, who asked me if I wanted to do this. And I said, absolutely. That sounds like a great experience. So eventually they started, filming, and they basically filmed me for my entire senior year of high school. Mm-hmm. So they followed me around with cameras, and it was this crazy experience, but everything you saw on the show was almost entirely true to life. It was very much a documentary style. It was not like reality TV, manufactured. It was very true to life. And it was a documentary film series that showed really accurately, I think, how living with Tourette can be like for, kids of all ages with Tourette.
I mean, that makes your job so much easier on the other side of it too, because if you were on a show that was kind of hyped up and didn't really honestly portray what you were going through, I think just kind of continuing your advocacy work would be kind of a cleanup process in a way of just kind of righting the ship again and saying, okay, let's repair the message, let's repair the portrayal. But you being honestly portrayed is a pretty amazing thing anyway, especially for the Tourette community, What kind of feedback did you get after that from, I mean, you have fans. I know this. I mean, what were people telling you?
Yeah, the accuracy was a big deal with my participation in the show. Me and my mom and my dad and my whole family made sure to talk with multiple producers and say, we don't want this to be manufactured. We want it to be a true, accurate depiction. And they were very adamant that yes, this is going to be, a documentary. It's not reality TV.
That's awesome.
It's not like Real Housewives of Tourette or anything.
Right.
So,
yeah. No, it's amazing that you went in with your eyes open like that. That is awesome.
Yeah. So I guess overall the reaction from the Tourette community has been very positive. Obviously it aired last August, so it's kind of been dying down a little bit, but I would like tweet and Instagram before every episode, and I would like talk about, make sure to watch the episode. And I think overall the reaction was really, really positive.
What followed that? I mean, did that connect you with other, so sometimes it gives you, going through an experience like this gives you new ideas for how you can, connect with the broader world and how you can kind of continue that work. What's been up since?
Before I went on the show, I was already so connected with the Tourette community. I mean, I was a youth ambassador and I met people that way, and I went to camp and I met people that way. And it just like being on the show kind of reaffirmed what I already knew as my place in the Tourette community, which is like, an advocate and, a supporter of people in the Tourette community. And so I think the show just kind of, reestablished and reaffirmed, my view of myself as an advocate, which I don't think it necessarily like, it's not that I didn't open any doors, but it just was more of a reaffirmation,
So what's something that you think needs to be accomplished? Something that maybe needs more attention?
Being an advocate as an adult, advocating for the adult community. Because a lot of what you see about Tourette is focused on children and like school accommodations and, a kid's experience. But what people really don't realize is that even when you're an adult, you still have Tourette's, and it's still a thing that, needs awareness put on,
It's really true what you said about the sort of, I guess, share of the portrayal and share the representation. That it's a pretty sensitive thing. I obviously I want there to be every resource there can possibly be for children with Tourette syndrome. I mean,
oh yeah, absolutely.
And always want to reach out, but at the same time, there are definitely, at least there's the perception out there that there's not as much for adults in terms of programming, and so far that seems to have borne out. I'm loving it that there are absolutely efforts and wheels turning right now to change that. And this podcast mostly talks with adults with TS, and for a number of different reasons. And we've had some younger people on as well, which has been awesome and has really brought some amazing perspective. Your adult life and sort of your post-college life and career life is kind of what you're staring at. And you want to have the resources. I mean, you are going to be the resource for a lot of people. I know that because of how passionate you are with your advocacy is amazing. But at the same time, there are a lot of adults who are going to need those resources too. And I just think it's very important that you're also putting an emphasis on that. I love that.
Yeah, definitely. I think, as a youth ambassador, I was focusing on, awareness for children and, helping their experiences in school. And that's one of the main issues with kids with Tourette's is the school accommodations and the schools being accepting and, that kind of thing. But as a person with Tourette's gets older, the struggles don't necessarily go away. They just change. And so then it's, getting a job with Tourette's or, going to college with Tourette's or, establishing yourself in the, world of adults while still having this thing. And I think being an advocate for adults is just as important as being an advocate for children.
So adding to the titles from the beginning of the episode, you're also an advocate for the LGBT plus community. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So this question, I hope it comes off intelligibly. It might sound lame or even kind of ignorant, but I mean, I've talked with several people from the LGBT plus community who have Tourette, and with many of them, not all, but many, they weren't open. They were not open about having TS, while they were open about being, for example, gay or trans. After difficult decisions deciding how to be open about that. And I'm not equating TS and LGBT.
Right.
Not saying the experiences are the same or sources or anything like that, but both, historically have had some social difficulties in terms of, acceptance and recognition and understanding. Do you have any thoughts on that? I mean, on what may be a really lame question, but I don't know. It comes up a few times.
No, I think it's an interesting question to ask. My experience in the LGBT community has been definitely overall very positive. I've accepting family and parents, and I think I've been as privileged as I can possibly be in terms of, being in the LGBT community. Being part of a community where the members, I think there's just a different sense of community within the two communities, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Like in the LGBT community, there's a very different vibe between the people than there is in the Tourette community. And I think there's been a longer history of LGBT representation and a fight for equality and equal access and things like that.
Right. Yeah.
And so overall, I think that fight has come a lot farther, just in terms of like how much they've had to go through and, what they've had to overcome. And so I think in that way, living today, people in the LGBT community are very proud of the LGBT history because it's come so far versus, in the Tourette community, Tourette's is still widely misunderstood and it's fairly new. It's fairly recently that it's come to public attention. And so I think that there's still a long way to go for people in the Tourette community to be like, not necessarily close knit, because there are people in the Tourette community who are very close to each other, but I think it's just a different experience. And so whereas someone in the LGBT community can feel like pride for being in that community, obviously you can be proud to have Tourette's, but it's not necessarily the same thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. And, for anybody listening, just to equip myself a little bit, again, I'm not equating LGBTQ and the experience and all that with TS, just pointing out the path of resistance that's met each individual. And it says a lot, though, about the power of speaking up and kind of owning it and having allies and having that community and doing something linking arms. And I feel really good right now about that power in the Tourette community and the experience right now. It just feels like there's a lot of that right now. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's like, where it used to be kind of the rule that Tourette syndrome would fare badly on TV. That's not really the case anymore. There's a lot of great personalities on TV, talking about Tourette syndrome. And yes, the jokes are still there and all that, and we need resources and funding and all that, but it just kind of feels better right now.
Yeah. And I think a lot of that has to do with the awareness that we're spreading, because Tourette's is so much more common than people think. Like I think the statistic is 1 in every 100 school-age children has either Tourette's or another tic disorder. Yeah. That's the same amount of children as children with autism, and that's like such a large. It's like 500,000 children in the United States.
Yeah,
and so oftentimes, like what happens is when I'll tell someone I have Tourette's, one of two things happens. They'll either say, "Oh, okay, whatever," or they'll tell me they know someone with Tourette's.
Yeah.
And just the fact that it's so much better diagnosed now and it's so much better understood now is really like shining a light on, it is common, and it's not something to be, ashamed of, and it's not something to be ridiculed. It's, just something that people have. And I think the fact that people are so much more aware today is really a testament to how much work has been done to spread that awareness.
Yeah. And that's a really great point about the diagnoses and the resources that are out there right now in the medical community to identify it, where, I just recall in my youth, it wasn't as simple as just showing up to the doctor, and it certainly isn't, nowadays either, but it's just the number of resources that exist right now to get that diagnosis are great. And it makes me, I guess, think that the next big challenge, because some people just don't have great access to medical care or to doctors in general, and they may have TS. It may, just no doubt about it, they've got it, but getting that diagnosis or accessing that, and then accessing the portals to management, whether it's CBIT or medication or whatever it is, I feel like that's
right.
that's the big fight on top of the straight up awareness effort that we have going, just to make sure that
Yeah, absolutely.
with this podcast, it's I never have diagnosis as a requirement to come on the show because, again, if you know you have it, there's no doubt in your mind. It's how you've lived. You know, you've even maybe just not wanted to talk about it with other people. That's totally fair game to me. And or if they're if they're in a position where they just don't have access to medical care or it's expensive, you know, I totally get that too. It just seems like that's a big thing ahead, is just to make sure that people have the access they need so they know and they know how to proceed.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Yeah, and I'm glad you kind of mentioned the whole medication aspect, because one of the things they taught me in the Youth Ambassador program, a saying was, some medication works for some people some of the time. So, like, because there is no, cure for Tourette, there is no one Tourette pill that can just magically make your tics go away. You know, in my experience with medication, it was like throwing darts in the dark, trying to find different medications that worked for me. And, luckily I've found, the ones that work for me now, but it was kind of a long and difficult, winding journey to find the right medications for my body, because everyone's body chemistry is different and everyone reacts to medications differently. Right. And so I think some people with Tourette's that I've met who have maybe more milder Tourette's have just avoided medication entirely because, there can be so many negative side effects that sometimes for people it's just not worth it to try medication. And I know people who have tried, all sorts of different things like fish oil and magnesium and different dietary restrictions and, no caffeine, no sugar, that kind of thing. And honestly, if it works for someone and it helps their tics, then I'd say go for it, because everyone's body's different and there is no one treatment that works for Tourette.
That's right. And, it's such a diverse thing anyway that, that you may have days on end where your tics are just out of control, and they're driving you up the wall.
Yeah.
And then you'll have a week off in a way. It's like, you still got it. You still have tics that show up every now and then, but the severity isn't quite there. And sometimes it's really, really hard to gauge what's what with that. It's like, it's like, I try something that I'm expecting to help me with my tics. And then a week later, my tics were really lenient. I don't know if that has anything to do with the pill or if that's just the weird nature of TS. At first, anyway.
Yeah, and the one of the main things I focus on again in the Youth Ambassador program is, Tourette's is so wildly different from person to person, and even within the same person, tics wax and wane, and they change over time. So, like I said before, when I was, in late middle school, early high school, my tics were very severe. Like I, punched holes in my wall, and I made my knuckles hurt, and it was just so crazy. Yeah. And now sitting here now, seeing the plaster in my wall that was covering a hole that I punched and realizing how far my tics have changed and how far I've come from how severe it was is just really, really crazy to me. Cause I can still remember when my tics were that bad, but I can't imagine having such severe tics now. And it's just absolutely wild how even within myself, within a few years, my Tourette's has changed so dramatically.
So do you have any practices or anything like that mantras or just exercises, anything that seems to help?
Yeah, so I did CBIT therapy for a while. Okay. And, in early high school, when my tics were really severe, it really helped for the really severe tics. So when with my full body shaking tics, I would just hold myself in a ball to redirect the urge. And so I had a shoulder rolling tic that was really painful. So I just hold my arm the other direction until the urge went away. Yeah. It was really, really effective for me personally for my severe tics, but for a lot of my small, just minor inconvenience tics, I have knuckle popping or it really wasn't nearly as effective because they just didn't bother me enough. So, with CBIT, it takes a lot of work to establish that redirect. And so I think for the minor tics, it really just wasn't worth it for me to try and redirect them when I could be focusing my energy on the bigger ticks.
Well, for you, did CBIT have any application with vocal tics, or was it pretty much just the bodily movement type things?
It was pretty much just the motor tics. I think I tried, I talked to my psychiatrist who was helping me with it, and she mentioned like trying it with the vocal tics, seeing how it works. But I think it's just really, really difficult to have CBIT. At least for me, it was very difficult to have CBIT be effective with my vocal tics.
Yeah, I think that's usually the case.
At least in my experience. Yeah, and at least in my experience, it's harder to find a position. Like the way CBIT worked for me is I find a position that prevents the tic from happening so I can redirect the energy. And so finding a position in like throat or your mouth that prevents the tic without like, biting your tongue off is really difficult. And so I think it was very effective for the major motor tics, but not necessarily for the vocal tics.
Gotcha. Well, so with your advocacy work, and I mean, do you commonly find people who have? It's kind of the Tourette syndrome is kind of like a universe, and I have sort of my own brand. You have your own brand. It's kind of rattling sometimes when you talk to other people who have the same identical tics as you, when you thought you were the only person in the world who had them. And I've definitely run into that on this podcast. Have you had that experience of talking with another Touretter and you're like, oh my God, that's I was totally the only one before I met you?
Not necessarily the same experience, but I will say when I went to camp, my vocal tics became like meaningful words and phrases. The complex vocal tics were really ramped up because I was around so many people with Tourette's. And I think what happened, I call it tic shopping, where there was I remember one year of camp, there was a tic. The movie Frozen had just came out, and so the tic was Let It Go. And so we would be in the mess hall eating breakfast or whatever. One person would yell, "Let it go," and then it would just bounce around the room from person to person. Yeah. And so, for maybe 5 minutes, it would just bounce around the room from person to person because everyone's tics were triggered by, every year there was a camp tic. So, people would all catch the same vocal tic. And I think it was just a really cool experience to, because at camp, it was just, this no barriers, free to just tic. I find in my personal life, even if I'm not intending to hold in my tics, I definitely do suppress my tics when I'm in class or in a job interview or something.
Yeah.
Just subconsciously, not even thinking about it. And then I'll find that when I'm sitting on the couch with my family watching TV, my vocal tics will just go crazy because I've been holding them in all day.
Yeah.
And so at camp, there's really no my body just doesn't need to hold in the tics anymore. And so it's just this kind of free-for-all where I just pick up tics left and right, which could be a negative thing, but I don't see it as that,
Yeah. So, and to be specific, are you kind of referencing the phenomenon when you're around other Touretters, you kind of adopt each other's tics, and this just kind of happened to be the one common thing that made it around? That's still the piece that kind of mystifies me, and it's just maybe it's kind of fun not understanding every little aspect of Tourette syndrome because it kind of feels magical in a way, and you don't want to ruin that. But it's such an interesting thing. I mean, does that happen to you? I mean, working in advocacy, do you find that you adopt other people's tics frequently?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. Whenever any two people with Tourette's are around each other, inevitably they're going to have at least one common tic. One common tic. But I find that, being around so many, so many different people with Tourette's, I pick up a lot of tics. One person I met through camp, her name's Summer. She lives in Florida too, and so we often spend the night at each other's house or whatever. And at one point, she had the word hexagon, and I had the word dodecahedron, and so we would just bounce back and forth. She'd be driving me to McDonald's for milkshakes or whatever, and we'd just be bouncing back and forth. Hexagon, dodecahedron, hexagon, dodecahedron, and it's the most random thing, who would think that that those particular words would be tics, but it just so happened that our brains decided to click like that.
I love it. See, I mean, that's kind of the fun side of it, because sometimes people will write in to the show and they'll have a question about, there's a Tourette syndrome support group in my in my city, or there's a Tourette conference coming up. I'm thinking about bringing my child to it, but it might upset his tics or it might inflame him. And kind of the quickest thing I think of is like that might happen, but it might also be kind of a good thing. And just that community that you can build around yourself. If it's a temporary discomfort, that you're going to be ticking more than you usually do, or you adopt new tics and all that. Just think of the positives that just come out with interacting with other people who have a totally, just their frame of reference lines right up. And how rare is that, when you're out there in the big world? I can only speak. I feel guilty giving people advice that may or may not work for them, but it just seems like it's a missed opportunity when the community's there and you don't necessarily take them up on it.
And another thing too is like tics can be funny sometimes.
Yeah.
Like in the certain situations, but when I'm with people with Tourette's and someone has a funny tic, like we all laugh about it because they're funny, and it's good to like see the bright side of it, because if you're so focused on the negative aspects, and if you're so focused on, oh, my life sucks because I have Tourette's, you're gonna miss all these great experiences where you can just laugh with your friends because your tics are funny.
Yeah.
And I think part of that too is finding the right people in your support network who can you feel comfortable laughing at yourself with, like when I'm with my friends who don't have Tourette's, when I have a funny tic and like I start laughing, they start laughing too, because my tics can be really funny sometimes, and it helps to just see the bright side of it.
Yeah, that's so important, and it's not to be confused with making a joke out of it, which is a totally different thing. It has to do with intention, has to do with, I mean, you're finding something in it that makes you smile, and there's so many times that like a brand new tic has come up that I haven't done before, and I'm like, what was that? Okay, that's a new tic, and I'll just kind of laugh to myself just catching it. Like I caught this tic red-handed. I know it's a tic, and I know I'm about to do it again in 5 seconds. And just the kind of absurdity of that makes me laugh. Like I love that. It just, if I wrote it out and gave it to somebody who had never heard of Tourette syndrome before, it would sound like the most absurd thing ever. And something about that I kind of like.
Yeah, like just recently I started doing a kissing tic.
Oh yeah. I've had something similar to that before. Yeah, that can be funny when you're out.
Yeah, so like it's kind of embarrassing when I'm walking down the street and I just start kissing at people, but it's just also really hilarious. And as long as the person doesn't think I'm weird, but like I am weird, so it's fine. I don't know. They're funny sometimes, and it's good to laugh at yourself every now and again.
Do you also find that it helps you connect with people? And what I find about myself is that me being as conscious as I am of myself and how I might come off to other people, it makes me want to give everybody else a break too. Just having that empathy. You might be going through something. I have no idea what it is. I'm not going to give you a hard time. Let's just kind of walk about our day peacefully. It's kind of made me that person. And I directly attribute that to having Tourette syndrome.
Yeah, I think, obviously when I'm in a new class and they're like, say one fun fact about yourself. My one fun fact is always inevitably, oh, by the way, I have Tourette syndrome. Which there are other interesting things about me, but in a new situation, it's important, at least for me, for people to know I have Tourette.
Yeah.
Someone knowing I have Tourette is very important, because if I don't tell them I have Tourette and some awkward situation comes down the line where they're like, why are you doing that? I'm like, oh, I didn't tell you I have Tourette. But, I think overall just having something that you're not necessarily, like, I'm not super self-conscious about my tics. Like sometimes I am, but usually I'm not. But having that awareness of myself has definitely, like you said, made me more aware of other people's situations.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, that keeps it's been coming up more and more in the recent interviews I've done. I think especially as I've talked to people of totally different generations and found that as sort of the common denominator of, I feel like I can understand other people's struggles better. And I'm putting struggles kind of in quotes because, what's a struggle to what somebody might perceive something that, may not be a struggle to me. But But
Yeah.
yeah, it does help with that. And that kind of, the question comes up, if we could edit genes and get rid of Tourette syndrome. I mean, it would feel like kind of a loss to me because so many good things can come out of having this. And,
Right.
if it was the kind of thing like, oh, we've eradicated Tourette syndrome, nobody's going to have it anymore, that would feel like a loss. I don't know. I mean, maybe I'm just being too much of an advocate or something, and I'm just, but it really does feel that way, that just having that appreciation kind of makes you, I don't want to say a better person, but certainly someone who kind of gets it in ways that others don't. And I know that sounds completely,
absolutely.
it sounds weird the way I said it, but you know what I mean?
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think that question of like, if they invented a pill tomorrow that would eliminate your Tourette's, would you take it? That question has bothered me for so many years because I honestly don't know what I would do.
Yeah.
Like, yeah, obviously my tics are annoying and they bother me. And sometimes there are days when I wish I didn't have tics. But at the same time, having Tourette's is such an integral part of my identity.
Yep.
And like through the Tourette community, I've had so many amazing experiences and met so many amazing people. And like being on this podcast, being on TV, being a youth ambassador, going to camp, like these are experiences that I would never have had otherwise. And
right.
If I didn't have Tourette's, I don't know how my life would change because I absolutely would not be the same person I am today if I didn't have Tourette's. Like Tourette's has made me a much better person because of the experiences I've had and because of just the way that it shaped my view on life and like my confidence and my ability to speak with new people. And I just, it's just such a tough question because at the end of the day, are the experiences worth the tics? And I think the experiences outweigh the tics so much more because they're just so powerful and important. And I think like these experiences that I've had, I wouldn't give up for the world.
Well, it seems to me that question and the way you answered it, I mean, that's an advocacy move right there. I mean, that the way you answered it, it was so well done and so agreeable. And, it's, and I think parents of recently diagnosed kids need to hear that kind of thing. It's nice to kind of hear that reassurance, even in my adult life, it's just having that message out there, especially if it reaches, people who, the non-Tourettic crowd or whatever you want to call them.
Right.
That, I think that helps all the more too. This is not something that we're embarrassed by and we're trying to run from. This is something that is just whatever. It's me, it's you. This is completely who we are as people who have Tourette syndrome. And I don't see it. I don't see the opportunity of taking a pill as something that would make myself better. I think I'm okay with where I am. And, I can only speak for myself because I don't know your experience. I don't know, the guy 10 miles away who has Tourette syndrome. I don't know his experience. He may have very painful tics and he may have a totally legitimate reason to say, yes, get this stuff away from me. But, things being what they are, and as individuals, we can answer this question individually. The way you answered it applies to a lot of people. And especially to the people I've talked to on this podcast who all seem to agree that they've been made better by having it. And yeah, just something really powerful about that.
Yeah, and I think I'm in no way like trying to make little or make smaller the experiences of people who, do have painful tics, who do, wish they didn't have tics, because obviously like I've been there, I've had really awful tics that I wish I didn't have. But I never wish I didn't have Tourette. And I think there's like a difference between wanting a bad tic to go away and wanting to not have Tourette, because, having Tourette is such an identity piece versus, the tics can change. The tics can come and go. And honestly, for a lot of young people who have bad Tourette, like in my personal experience, it got so much better as I got older. And so while the tics get better and change, and I wanted the tics to get better, I never necessarily wanted them to disappear completely, because like it would just be so weird living without tics. Like I can't imagine not having the tic. Like it's just something that's I'm so used to it, but I cannot imagine just not having the urge to tick. Like, it's just unfathomable.
That's kind of, I'd never really thought of it this way, but in the way that I've heard it explained to me by, just everyday people out there in the world, when I've explained my Tourette's to them and what it's like to tick and feel the urge. And sometimes it just happens unexpectedly. And they'll say, and just kind of like that mystification thing we were talking about earlier, where it's like, I can't imagine what it's like to have to do that, to have no control over and I had never thought of it the opposite way, the way you just said it. Like, I can't imagine I can't imagine living your life and not having that, come and visit me a million times during the day. That's just a completely, even if I take medication to cool my tics out, just having Tourette syndrome and being more than tics it's just, I don't know how you can pull that away from anybody who has it. It would just be a strange feeling world without it.
Yeah, I totally get what you mean.
Thanks for listening, and thanks to Kristin for opening up to us here. I'm a fan. What'd you guys think? What'd she say that stood out to you? Tourette'sPodcast@gmail.com, @Tourette'sPod on Twitter, Tourette's Podcast on Instagram, Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook. Patreon.com/Tourette's Podcast to support the show. Thanks to each and every one of you doing so. And of course, geeksrising.com for this and other great podcasts that I learn a lot from. All ways that you can find and connect with this podcast. Again, Tourette's Podcast, part of the Geeks Rising Network at geeksrising.com. Shout out to the Sunshine and Power Cuts podcast. Learning a lot from that. Thanks again, everybody. This is Ben.